The morning sun cast golden rays across the palace grounds as the Martinez family made their way through the main gates. Sarah Martinez clutched her camera tightly, her hands trembling with excitement. Beside her, her husband David pushed their 8-year-old son Tommy in his wheelchair, carefully navigating the cobblestone pathway. Tommy's eyes sparkled with wonder as he took in the magnificent stone walls and towering spires that reached toward the sky. This trip had been 2 years in the making. Ever since Tommy had watched a documentary about royal guards and their unwavering dedication to duty, he had dreamed of seeing them in person. The boy had filled notebooks with drawings of guards in their ceremonial uniforms, complete with tall bearskin hats and gleaming buttons. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures he had printed from the internet, each one carefully taped in place with his own hands. Tommy had been born with a rare spinal condition that left him unable to walk. Doctors had tried various treatments over the years, but nothing had given him the strength to stand on his own. Despite this challenge, the boy possessed a spirit that refused to be dimmed. He excelled in his studies, made friends easily at school, and never complained about the limitations his body placed upon him. His parents often marveled at his resilience, his ability to find joy in every situation. The family joined a group of tourists gathering near the palace entrance. A guide began explaining the history of the royal guards, their origins dating back centuries, and the rigorous training they underwent. Tommy listened intently, absorbing every word. He had read much of this information before, but hearing it spoken aloud while standing before the actual palace made it feel magical and real. David wheeled Tommy closer to the rope barriers that kept visitors at a respectful distance from the guards. 3 guards stood at attention in their positions, perfectly still, their expressions neutral and professional. Their red ceremonial jackets were immaculate, and their tall black hats added an imposing height to their already impressive stature. Tommy stared at them with open admiration, his mouth slightly agape. Sarah knelt beside her son's wheelchair and whispered, "What do you think, sweetheart? Are they everything you imagined?" Tommy nodded vigorously, unable to tear his gaze away from the guards. One guard in particular had caught his attention. He stood directly in front of them, a tall man with a strong jawline and kind eyes that occasionally flickered toward the crowd, though his head remained perfectly still. The family spent the next hour exploring the palace grounds. They visited the gift shop where Sarah bought Tommy a small toy guard figurine that he immediately treasured. They ate lunch at a nearby cafe, with Tommy chattering excitedly about every detail he had observed. He described the exact shade of red in the uniforms, the way the guards held their rifles, and the precise angle of their hats. As the afternoon wore on, they returned to the area where the guards were stationed. The crowds had thinned somewhat, and they found a spot with a better view. Tommy had brought along a small sketchbook, and he began drawing one of the guards with careful concentration. His pencil moved across the page, capturing the straight posture and formal bearing with surprising accuracy for a child his age. David noticed his son shivering slightly. The day had started warm, but clouds had rolled in, and a cool breeze now swept across the palace grounds. He pulled a jacket from the bag hanging on the wheelchair and draped it over Tommy's shoulders. The boy barely noticed, so focused was he on his drawing. Sarah checked her watch and felt a pang of sadness. They would need to leave soon to catch their train home. This trip had been expensive, requiring careful saving and planning. They lived in a small town several hours away, and opportunities like this were rare. She wanted to make every remaining moment count for Tommy. A small commotion near the guard posts caught their attention. A tourist had apparently gotten too close to the barriers, and a guard had to step out of position momentarily to guide them back. The crowd murmured with interest. Tommy looked up from his drawing, concerned that he had missed something important. The guard who had moved was the same one Tommy had been sketching. He was now returning to his position, and as he did so, his eyes swept across the crowd. For just a moment, his gaze landed on Tommy. The boy's face lit up with an enormous smile, and he gave a small wave. The guard's expression remained neutral, but there was a subtle softness in his eyes that Sarah noticed from where she stood. David suggested they start making their way toward the exit. The train station was a 20-minute walk, and they needed to allow extra time with the wheelchair. Tommy looked disappointed but nodded in understanding. He carefully closed his sketchbook and tucked his pencil into the side pocket of his wheelchair. As they began to move away, Tommy turned back for one last look at the guards. The palace, the uniforms, the ceremony of it all had exceeded his dreams. He knew he would remember this day for the rest of his life. The images would sustain him through difficult physical therapy sessions and challenging days at school. Sarah paused to take a few final photographs. She captured the palace facade, the guard posts, and a shot of Tommy with the palace in the background. These photos would join the collection in Tommy's room, proof that dreams could sometimes come true with patience and determination. The family moved slowly along the path toward the exit gates. Other tourists bustled past them, some rushing to see other attractions, others simply eager to move on. But the Martinez family took their time, savoring these last moments in a place that had brought their son such happiness. Tommy held his toy guard figurine in his lap, occasionally looking down at it and smiling. He imagined the stories it could tell if it could speak, the history it represented. His mind was already planning the report he would write for his class at school. His teacher had encouraged him to document the trip, and he had so much to share. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the grounds. The palace took on a different character in this softer light, seeming almost dreamlike. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she realized how much this visit meant to Tommy, how his face had glowed with pure joy throughout the day. As they approached the gates, a palace staff member smiled warmly at Tommy and wished him a good journey home. These small kindnesses had marked their entire visit. Despite Tommy's wheelchair, despite the challenges of navigating crowds and uneven pathways, they had felt welcome and respected at every turn. What none of them knew as they headed toward the exit was that their day at the palace was not quite over. Behind them, the guard Tommy had been drawing was speaking quietly to a fellow guard. Something about the boy in the wheelchair had touched his heart. The guard's name was James, and he had served in this position for 5 years. He had seen thousands of tourists. But something about Tommy's pure admiration and unguarded joy had moved him deeply. James made a decision that would change the Martinez family's day in ways they could never have anticipated. James watched the family moving toward the exit, and something inside him refused to let them leave without acting. He had strict protocols to follow, specific rules about maintaining his position and not breaking character during duty hours. Yet every fiber of his being told him that this moment mattered more than any protocol. He caught the eye of his supervising officer, who stood partially hidden near one of the palace doorways. James made a subtle gesture, a quick signal they used when something important needed to be communicated. The officer frowned slightly but moved closer to hear what James had to say. Speaking in a low, urgent voice, James explained about the boy in the wheelchair, his obvious admiration for the guards, and a request that broke protocol in the most beautiful way. The supervising officer, a man named Captain Reynolds who had served for 20 years, listened carefully. His face softened as James described Tommy's drawings and the pure joy on the child's face throughout the visit. Captain Reynolds was quiet for a long moment, weighing duty against compassion, rules against humanity. Then he gave a slight nod. James would have 5 minutes, no more. But those 5 minutes could be used as he saw fit. The captain would ensure no other tourists interfered during that brief window of time. James moved quickly, his training allowing him to cross the distance with both speed and dignity. The Martinez family had nearly reached the exit gates when they heard a voice calling out, "Excuse me, please wait." They turned to see the tall guard approaching them, and confusion mixed with curiosity crossed their faces. David instinctively moved closer to Tommy's wheelchair, a protective gesture born from years of navigating a world not always designed for his son. Sarah's hand went to her heart, wondering if something was wrong, if they had somehow violated a rule without knowing it. James slowed his pace as he neared them, not wanting to appear intimidating. He removed his tall bearskin hat, revealing short brown hair slightly damp with perspiration. His face, which had seemed so stern and formal from a distance, now showed genuine warmth. He knelt down on one knee beside Tommy's wheelchair, bringing himself to the boy's eye level. "Hello there, young man," James said, his voice gentle and kind. "I noticed you watching us today and I saw your drawings. You're quite the artist." Tommy's eyes went wide with shock and delight. He clutched his sketchbook tightly, unable to believe that one of the royal guards was actually speaking to him. "Thank you, sir," Tommy managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. Sarah and David exchanged glances. still uncertain about what was happening but beginning to sense that this was something special. James smiled warmly. I've been a royal guard for 5 years, and I can honestly say that no one has ever watched us with quite as much admiration as you showed today. It reminded me why I'm proud to wear this uniform. He gestured to his ceremonial jacket, its red fabric bright even in the fading afternoon light. Tommy found his voice growing stronger. I've wanted to see the royal guards my whole life. You're all so brave and strong. The way you stand so still and proud, it's amazing. His words tumbled out in a rush, years of admiration pouring forth in a single moment. James nodded thoughtfully. It takes training and discipline, that's true. But do you know what I think takes even more courage? He paused, making sure he had Tommy's full attention. Facing each day with a smile when things are difficult. Pursuing your dreams even when obstacles stand in your way. That kind of courage is far greater than anything I do here at the palace. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. This guard, this stranger, saw her son not as someone limited by his wheelchair, but as someone brave and admirable. It was a gift beyond measure. David placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. They had spent years advocating for Tommy, fighting to ensure he received the opportunities and respect he deserved. To have this moment of recognition, especially in a place Tommy loved so much, felt almost surreal. James continued speaking, his attention fully focused on Tommy. I was watching you today, and I saw how interested you were in everything about the guards. The way we stand, the way we hold ourselves. Would you like to know a secret? Tommy nodded eagerly, leaning forward in his wheelchair. Every guard who serves here started out as someone who dreamed of being part of something bigger than themselves. We come from all different backgrounds, all different places, but we share a commitment to duty, honor, and service. Those qualities aren't about physical strength, they're about strength of character. And from what I've seen today, you have that kind of strength in abundance. Tommy's face glowed with pride and happiness. Never had anyone spoken to him quite like this, treating him not as a child to be pitied, but as someone worthy of respect and admiration. James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small item. It was a pin, an official Royal Guard insignia, the kind that guards themselves wore on certain occasions. James held it up so Tommy could see it clearly. The pin featured a crown above crossed swords, all rendered in brass that gleamed despite its age. This was given to me when I completed my training, James explained. Every guard receives one as a symbol of their commitment to serve. I'd like you to have mine, because I believe you embody the same principles we guards hold dear: courage, determination, and an unwavering spirit. Tommy's mouth fell open in shock. But that's yours. It's special to you. His young voice trembled with emotion. James smiled and gently pressed the pin into Tommy's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it. It is special, and that's exactly why I want you to have it. When you look at it, remember that a royal guard saw in you the qualities that matter most. Not what our bodies can do, but who we are inside. The strength of our hearts and minds. Sarah was openly crying now, tears streaming down her face as she watched this extraordinary exchange. David had to turn away briefly, using the excuse of wiping his glasses to hide his own tears. Other tourists had begun to notice the scene, but Captain Reynolds and another guard had quietly formed a barrier, ensuring the family had privacy for this moment. James stood up and came to attention, giving Tommy a formal salute. The gesture was crisp and perfect, exactly as would be rendered to a superior officer. Tommy, hardly believing what was happening, attempted to salute back. His arm movement was awkward, limited by his condition, but the intention and respect were clear. It would be my honor, James said, maintaining his salute, to take a photograph with you, if your parents permit it. Sarah nearly laughed through her tears, nodding vigorously while fumbling for her camera. Of course they permitted it. This was becoming the most memorable day of Tommy's entire life. James moved behind Tommy's wheelchair, standing at attention with his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. David stepped back to stand beside Sarah, both of them watching as James and Tommy prepared for the photo. The boy sat up as straight as he could in his wheelchair, his face radiating pure happiness. He held the guard pin carefully in one hand, already treating it like the precious treasure it was. Sarah raised her camera, but her hands were shaking so badly that she struggled to frame the shot properly. A kind tourist standing nearby offered to take the photo, sensing that this was a moment the family would want to be in together. The stranger took several photos, making sure to capture different angles. Then James did something that no one expected. He knelt down beside the wheelchair again and spoke softly to Tommy, his voice low enough that only the boy and his parents could hear. "Tommy, I have an idea, but I need to ask your permission first. Would it be all right if I helped you stand for a photograph? I would hold you securely, supporting your weight completely. You wouldn't have to do anything except let me help you." The question hung in the air like a delicate bubble, beautiful but fragile. Tommy looked at his parents, his eyes asking a question he had never dared to ask before. Could he? Was it possible? Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew Tommy's limitations, knew that his legs could not support his weight. But the hope on her son's face was impossible to deny. David moved closer, his protective instincts warring with his desire to give his son this experience. "Are you sure?" he asked James, his voice thick with emotion. "He can't support himself. His legs don't have the strength." James met David's eyes with complete confidence and understanding. "I know, sir. I will hold him completely. He will be safe, I promise you. I've carried wounded soldiers who weighed far more than your son. I know how to support someone properly and securely." There was something in James's demeanor that inspired trust. Perhaps it was his military bearing, the calm confidence of someone trained to handle difficult situations. Or perhaps it was simply the genuine kindness and care evident in every word he spoke. Sarah and David looked at each other, communicating in the silent language that married couples develop over years together. "Okay," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If Tommy wants to and you're certain he'll be safe." She looked at her son. "What do you think, sweetheart? Would you like to try standing with the guard's help?" Tommy nodded, his whole body trembling with excitement and nervousness. "Yes," he said firmly. "Yes, I want to try." His voice gained strength as he spoke, determination filling each word. This was an opportunity he had never imagined, a chance to stand tall like the guards he so admired. James smiled and began explaining exactly what he would do, his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm going to position myself behind you and slide my arms under yours. I'll lift you gently, keeping you secure against my chest. Your feet might touch the ground, but I'll be holding your full weight. If at any point you feel uncomfortable or scared, just say so and I'll set you right back in your wheelchair. Does that sound all right?" Tommy nodded again, gripping the armrests of his wheelchair tightly. Captain Reynolds, still standing nearby, watched the scene with his arms crossed but made no move to interfere. He had seen many things in his years of service, but this simple act of kindness was touching something deep within his usually stoic heart. James positioned himself carefully, moving with practiced precision. He locked the wheelchair's brakes and made sure it wouldn't shift. Then he crouched behind Tommy, explaining each movement before he made it. "I'm going to put my arms under yours now," he said softly. Tommy felt the strength in the guard's arms as they slid beneath his own, crossing over his chest in a secure hold. "Ready?" James asked. Tommy whispered yes, and then with a smooth, controlled motion, James lifted him. The boy rose from his wheelchair, his feet dangling several inches above the ground initially, and then James lowered him slightly so his shoes just touched the cobblestones beneath them. But all of Tommy's weight was held securely by the guard's strong arms. For the first time in his 8 years of life, Tommy was upright, standing at a height he could only achieve in his dreams. The world looked different from this angle. He was eye to eye with people standing around them, rather than looking up at everyone from his seated position. The palace spires seemed somehow closer, more reachable. Sarah gasped and immediately raised her camera, her hands still shaking, but determination overriding her emotions. She had to capture this moment. David stood frozen, watching his son stand tall with the help of this remarkable guard. Tears poured down his face unchecked, and he made no effort to wipe them away. Tommy looked down at his feet touching the ground, hardly believing what was happening. He could feel James's strong arm supporting him, could feel the guard's chest against his back, solid and secure. There was no fear, only wonder and overwhelming joy. "How does it feel?" James asked quietly, his voice warm near Tommy's ear. "Amazing," Tommy breathed. "I feel so tall. I can see everything." His voice was filled with awe. He looked around, taking in the palace grounds from this new perspective. The guards at their posts, the tourists watching with smiles and their own tears. the palace itself seeming to reach down to meet him at this height. Sarah was taking photo after photo, desperate to capture every angle, every moment of this miracle. The tourist who had offered to help took more photos showing the whole family, ensuring that Sarah and David would also be in these precious images. Other tourists had noticed what was happening, and many were watching with their hands over their hearts, moved by the simple beauty of the scene. "You're doing great," James encouraged. "Stand proud. You're standing with a royal guard after all." There was gentle humor in his voice, and Tommy laughed, a sound of pure, unbridled happiness. James carefully turned them both slightly, allowing Tommy to face different directions, to see the palace from various angles while standing. Captain Reynolds stepped forward and said quietly to Sarah and David, "Take all the time you need. Don't rush this." His gruff voice was softer than usual, touched by the same emotion affecting everyone present. He had bent protocols significantly to allow this to happen, but watching the scene before him, he knew it was absolutely the right decision. Tommy lifted his arm slightly, and James adjusted his hold to accommodate the movement while keeping the boy completely secure. Tommy raised his hands toward the sky, toward the palace spires, as if he could touch the dreams he had held for so long. The gesture was so innocent, so filled with joy, that several of the watching tourists openly began crying. Sarah set down her camera and simply watched, wanting to imprint this image in her memory beyond what any photograph could capture. Her son, standing tall and proud, held safely in the arms of a kind stranger who had seen past the wheelchair to the brave, beautiful boy inside. This was what every parent wanted for their child, to be seen, valued, and given the chance to experience their dreams. David moved closer and spoke to Tommy. "How are you feeling, son? Are you okay?" He needed to check, to make sure his child was truly comfortable and not just tolerating discomfort because of the excitement. Tommy turned his head to look at his father, and his smile was blinding. "Dad, I'm standing," he said, as if he still couldn't quite believe it. "I'm really standing." His voice cracked with emotion, and David reached out to gently touch his son's face, a gesture of love and connection. "I know, buddy," David said, his own voice unsteady. "You're standing tall and proud just like you always do in here." He tapped Tommy's chest lightly over his heart. "But now everyone else can see it too." James continued to hold Tommy securely, his military training evident in the steadiness of his arms, the way he showed no strain despite holding the boy's full weight. He had carried far heavier loads during his service, but none had felt quite as important as this small child who loved royal guards and dreamed of standing tall. "Would you like to salute while you're standing?" James asked. "We could salute together as guards do when showing respect to their fellow soldiers." Tommy's eyes widened at the suggestion. To salute while standing, to perform that formal gesture just like the real guards did. It was almost too much happiness to contain. "Yes, please," Tommy said eagerly. James carefully adjusted his hold, ensuring Tommy was still completely secure but freeing the boy's right arm to move more easily. Then, with James's guidance whispered in his ear, Tommy raised his right hand to his forehead in a salute. James lifted his own free hand to join Tommy in the salute, both of them holding the formal position. Captain Reynolds, moved beyond words, came to attention and returned their salute with crisp military precision. The moment was captured in dozens of photographs from multiple cameras as tourists recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The salute held for several heartbeats, a perfect moment suspended in time. Tommy felt pride swelling in his chest, a feeling of accomplishment and belonging he had never experienced before. He was standing, saluting, participating in a ceremony that connected him to something larger than himself. The limitations of his body seemed to dissolve in that instant, replaced by the limitless strength of his spirit. When they lowered their hands, Tommy's face was wet with tears, though his smile never wavered. These were not tears of sadness but of overwhelming emotion, the kind that comes when something deeply desired is finally realized. He had imagined standing so many times, wondering what it might feel like, and the reality exceeded anything his imagination had created. "Thank you," Tommy whispered, his voice choked with feeling. "Thank you so much." The words seemed inadequate for the gift he had been given, but they were all he could manage through his tears. James's own eyes were suspiciously bright as he responded, "The honor is mine, Tommy. Truly." You've reminded me why I became a guard in the first place. Not for the ceremony or the uniform, but to serve others and to protect what matters most. Thank you for that reminder. Sarah had stopped taking photos, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck as she and David held each other, both crying freely. They had spent years helping Tommy navigate a world that often seemed designed without consideration for his needs. They had fought battles with insurance companies, advocated with school administrators, and carried the weight of knowing their son faced challenges that would follow him throughout his life. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Their son was standing, held safely by a stranger who had shown more compassion in 10 minutes than some people managed in a lifetime. The weight they carried felt lighter somehow, lifted by the simple proof that kindness still existed in the world, that strangers could see past differences to the person underneath. Captain Reynolds checked his watch, a practical gesture that reminded everyone that this magical moment existed within the constraints of the real world. He caught James's eye and gave a subtle signal. Time was running short and they needed to return to their duties. But he allowed a few more precious seconds, understanding that some moments were worth bending the rules. James sensed the signal and spoke gently to Tommy. I need to set you back down now, okay? But I want you to remember this feeling. Remember standing tall and proud. You can carry this with you always. In here. He tapped lightly on Tommy's chest over his heart, echoing David's earlier gesture. Tommy nodded, understanding though disappointment flickered across his face. He had known this moment couldn't last forever, but part of him had wished it could. Okay, he said softly. I'm ready. With the same careful control he had shown when lifting Tommy, James slowly lowered the boy back into his wheelchair. He made sure Tommy was positioned comfortably, adjusting the chair slightly and ensuring the boy's feet were properly placed on the footrests. Every movement was gentle and respectful, treating Tommy with dignity throughout the process. Once Tommy was settled, James moved to stand in front of the wheelchair. He straightened his uniform, smoothed his jacket, and retrieved his tall bearskin hat. But before putting it back on, he knelt one final time beside Tommy. From his pocket, he pulled out a small card with his name and an email address written on it. I want you to write to me, James said, pressing the card into Tommy's hand alongside the guard pin he had given earlier. Tell me about your life, your school, your drawings. I want to know how you're doing. And if you ever come back to visit the palace, you let me know in advance. I'll arrange for a proper tour, one where you can meet all the guards and learn about everything we do. Tommy clutched the card like it was made of gold. Really? You really want me to write to you? His voice held a note of disbelief, as if this kindness was almost too much to accept. Really? James confirmed with a warm smile. I don't give my contact information to just anyone. But you're special, Tommy. You reminded me of something important today and I don't want to forget it. Your letters will help me remember. David stepped forward and extended his hand to James. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. What you've done for our son today, the way you've made him feel seen and valued, it means more than you could possibly know. James stood and shook David's hand firmly. No thanks needed, sir. Your son is remarkable. Any time I spent with him was a gift to me. He turned to Sarah, who was wiping tears from her face with a tissue. Ma'am, you have an incredible young man there. I hope he always knows how special he is. Sarah couldn't speak, could only nod as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She pulled James into an unexpected hug, which he returned warmly. When she finally released him, she managed to whisper, Thank you. Thank you for seeing him, really seeing him. James replaced his tall hat and came to attention one final time. He rendered a perfect salute to Tommy, who returned it as best he could from his wheelchair. The tourist who had been taking photos captured this last exchange, the final image of an extraordinary encounter. As James prepared to return to his post, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. They had witnessed the entire interaction, and many were crying openly. When James turned to walk back toward the guard station, someone began to clap. The applause spread quickly through the crowd, building into sustained appreciation for what they had witnessed. James paused briefly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but he nodded acknowledgement to the crowd before continuing on his way. He resumed his position at the guard post, settling back into the formal, rigid stance required of his duty. But something had changed in his bearing, something that only those who had watched the entire scene could detect. There was a softness around his eyes, a subtle reminder of the humanity beneath the ceremonial uniform. Captain Reynolds joined James at his post and spoke quietly. "That was well done, soldier. Very well done indeed." Coming from the typically stern captain, the praise meant everything. James simply nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he tried to speak. The Martinez family remained where they were for several minutes, none of them quite ready to leave. Tommy held the guard pin in one hand and the contact card in the other, looking between them as if he needed to confirm they were real. His sketchbook lay open on his lap, and he suddenly picked up his pencil and began adding to his drawing of James. Sarah and David stood behind the wheelchair, their hands resting on each other's shoulders, both still processing what had happened. They watched as Tommy added details to his sketch, capturing not just the uniform and posture, but somehow managing to convey the kindness and warmth that James had shown. Other tourists approached the family, some offering words of encouragement, others simply smiling with tears in their eyes. An elderly woman stopped beside Tommy's wheelchair and said, "Young man, that was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. You stood so proud and tall. You should be very pleased with yourself." Tommy looked up at her and smiled. "It felt amazing," he said simply. "I'll never forget it." The woman patted his shoulder gently before moving on, but her words joined the chorus of affirmation that surrounded the boy. A middle-aged man who had been watching approached David and spoke in a low voice. "I'm a physical therapist," he said. "I work with children who have mobility challenges. What that guard did for your son, the emotional impact of that experience, it's something that will stay with him forever. It might even motivate him in ways that traditional therapy hasn't been able to reach." David nodded, considering the man's words. He had seen the transformation in Tommy's face, the way standing had made his son feel powerful and capable. Perhaps this experience would indeed open new doors in Tommy's journey. "Thank you," David said. "I think you might be right." Eventually, the family knew they truly had to leave or they would miss their train. Sarah checked the time and calculated that they would need to hurry now. But somehow the urgency felt less stressful than before. They were leaving with something far more valuable than they had arrived with, a memory and an experience that would shape Tommy's life. David began pushing the wheelchair toward the exit, and this time they made it through the gates. But every few steps one of them would look back at the palace, at the guard posts where James still stood at attention. Tommy twisted in his chair repeatedly, wanting to keep the palace in sight for as long as possible. The walk to the train station passed in a blur of conversation. Tommy talked nonstop, reliving every moment of his interaction with James, describing how it felt to stand, marveling at the guard pin he still clutched tightly. Sarah and David let him talk, knowing he needed to process the experience through words, to make it real by speaking it aloud. Other pedestrians noticed Tommy's animated conversation, saw the joy radiating from the family, and smiled as they passed. Several people seemed to recognize them from the palace, having been in the crowd that witnessed the interaction. A few offered congratulatory words or thumbs-up gestures, sharing in the family's happiness. They reached the train station with just minutes to spare. David purchased platform tickets from a machine while Sarah helped Tommy transfer his precious guard pin and card into the secure zippered pocket of his jacket. They didn't want to risk losing these treasures during the journey home. On the platform, they found themselves standing near a young family with two small children. The mother noticed Tommy's excited chatter and smiled warmly. "Someone had a good day," she commented to Sarah. Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy. "The best day of his life, I think." A royal guard helped him stand for the first time. It was absolutely magical. As she spoke the words aloud to a stranger, the reality of it hit her again, and tears sprang fresh to her eyes. The other mother's expression softened with understanding and shared emotion. "What a beautiful gift," she said quietly. "Those are the moments we remember forever." Her children, sensing something important in the adult conversation, even if they didn't understand the details, looked at Tommy with wide, curious eyes. The train arrived, and David navigated the wheelchair aboard with practiced skill. They found seats in a designated accessible area, and Tommy positioned himself by the window. As the train pulled away from the station, he watched the city passing by, still clutching his guard pin. Sarah pulled out her camera and began scrolling through the photos she had taken. Each image was precious, capturing different angles and moments of Tommy's time standing with James. There were shots of Tommy's face lit with joy, close-ups of their joined salute, wide shots showing the palace in the background. She knew these photos would be enlarged, framed, and treasured for the rest of their lives. David sat beside his wife and looked at the photos over her shoulder. When he saw the image of Tommy saluting while standing, his face crumpled with fresh emotion. "I never thought I'd see that," he whispered. "I never dared to hope he could have that experience." Sarah leaned into her husband's shoulder. "That guard, James, he saw Tommy. Not the wheelchair, not the limitations, but our son. The boy who dreams big and loves with his whole heart. He saw him and gave him the world in 5 minutes." Tommy, hearing his parents' quiet conversation, turned from the window. "I'm going to write to him as soon as we get home," he announced. "I'm going to tell him thank you again and send him my best drawings. Maybe I'll draw a picture of today of me standing with him." "That sounds perfect," Sarah agreed. "I'm sure he would love that." She suspected that James would indeed appreciate letters from Tommy, that the guard had meant every word when he asked to stay in touch. There had been something genuine in his offer. A real connection formed in those brief minutes. The train journey home took several hours, and Tommy dozed off partway through, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the day. Sarah used the quiet time to upload the photos from her camera to her phone, immediately sending several to her mother and close friends with brief explanations. The responses came quickly, filled with crying emojis and expressions of joy and disbelief. Her mother called immediately, and Sarah stepped into the space between train cars to answer so she wouldn't wake Tommy. She recounted the entire story, her mother exclaiming and crying on the other end of the line. "That guard is an angel," her mother declared. An absolute angel sent to give Tommy exactly what he needed. When Sarah returned to her seat, David showed her his phone. He had been researching the Royal Guards, reading about their training and duties, wanting to understand more about the world that had given their son such joy. He had also found information about writing letters of commendation, and he planned to send one to the palace praising James for his kindness and professionalism. Tommy woke as the train neared their home station, immediately checking his pocket to ensure the guard pin and contact card were still safely there. Finding them secure, he relaxed and began looking out the window again, watching familiar landmarks pass by. Their small town appeared almost exactly as they had left it that morning, but everything felt different now. They disembarked from the train and made their way to their car in the station parking lot. The evening air was cool and fresh, and the sky was beginning to show the first stars. Tommy looked up at those stars and thought about the palace spires reaching toward them, about standing tall enough to feel closer to the sky. The drive home was quiet, all three of them lost in their own thoughts and memories of the day. When they pulled into their driveway, their neighbor Mrs. Chen was watering her garden and waved enthusiastically. "How was your trip?" she called out. "It was perfect," David called back. "Absolutely perfect." Mrs. Chen smiled, pleased to hear it, though she couldn't know the depth of meaning behind his words. They would tell her the story eventually, probably within the next day or two, but for now it felt precious and private, something to hold close as a family. Inside their home, everything was exactly as they had left it, but it all seemed different through the lens of the day's experience. Tommy wanted to go straight to his room, to find the perfect place to display his guard pin. Sarah suggested they eat dinner first, knowing Tommy would get so absorbed in arranging his treasures that he might forget about food entirely. They ordered pizza, too tired to cook after the long day, and ate together at the kitchen table. Tommy talked through the entire meal, repeating stories he had already told multiple times but needing to relive them again. Sarah and David listened patiently, knowing that this processing was important for their son. After dinner, Tommy went to his room with his parents following. He surveyed his walls, already covered with pictures of royal guards, trying to decide where the pin should go. Finally, he selected a spot on a shelf directly above his bed, where he would see it first thing every morning and last thing every night. David helped him arrange the pin on a small stand they found in Tommy's desk drawer, originally intended for displaying collectible coins. The brass gleamed under Tommy's desk lamp, the crown and crossed sword symbol perfectly visible. Beside it, Tommy placed the card with James's contact information, propping it against a book so it stood upright. Sarah printed several of the photos on their home printer, and they selected the best one of Tommy standing and saluting with James. This they placed in a frame that had been waiting empty on Tommy's dresser. The moment it was secured in the frame, it became real in a new way, preserved and official. Tommy sat on his bed and looked at his newly arranged treasures, his face glowing with contentment. "This was the best day of my whole life," he said firmly. "Nothing will ever be better than today." Sarah sat beside him and pulled him into a hug. "It was a pretty spectacular day," she agreed. "And you know what? You made it possible by being exactly who you are. James noticed you because of your genuine appreciation and your kind spirit. Those qualities drew him to you." David joined them on the bed, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a few moments, simply being present with each other and the happiness of the day. Later that evening, after Tommy had finally gone to bed, Sarah and David sat together in their living room, processing everything that had happened. Sarah had her laptop open, looking at the photos again, while David simply sat with his thoughts. "Do you think he understands how special this was?" David asked quietly. "I mean, really understands how rare it is for someone to show that kind of compassion to a complete stranger?" Sarah considered the question. "I think he understands that it was special and that it made him feel valued. Maybe he's too young to fully grasp how extraordinary James's actions were, but he'll understand more as he gets older, and we'll always be able to tell him this story, to remind him that there are people in the world who see beyond surface limitations." David nodded slowly. "I want to make sure James knows the impact he had. Writing a letter of commendation feels important, but it doesn't seem like enough somehow." "It's a start," Sarah said, "and Tommy will write to him like he promised. I think those letters will mean more to James than any official commendation. He'll get to see how his kindness continues to affect Tommy's life." The weeks following their palace visit brought changes to Tommy's daily life in subtle but meaningful ways. He wore the guard pin to school, carefully attached to his backpack where everyone could see it. When classmates asked about it, he proudly told the story of standing with the Royal Guard, his face lighting up with each retelling. His teacher, Mrs. Patterson, invited him to share the experience with the entire class. Tommy brought in the photos his mother had printed, passing them around while he narrated the story. His classmates listened with rapt attention, many of them seeing Tommy in a new light. The boy in the wheelchair wasn't just their friend Tommy anymore. He was someone who had experienced something remarkable, someone connected to the Royal Guards they had only read about in books. Mrs. Patterson used the opportunity to lead a discussion about kindness, empathy, and seeing past differences to the person underneath. She asked the students to think about times when they could be like James, when they could help others feel valued and capable. The lesson resonated deeply, and Tommy found himself surrounded by friends who seemed more considerate, more aware of how their actions could impact others. True to his word, Tommy wrote to James that very first week. His letter was written in careful handwriting, with several spelling errors that Sarah gently corrected. He told James about his school, his favorite subjects, his friends, and his dreams of someday becoming a historian specializing in military traditions. He included 3 drawings, one of James at his post, one of the moment when he stood with the guard's help, and one of the guard pin that now held pride of place in his room. Sarah helped him find the correct address for the palace and included a brief note of her own, thanking James again and letting him know that the experience had positively impacted Tommy in ways they were still discovering. They mailed the letter with high hopes but uncertain expectations, not knowing if a busy royal guard would truly have time to respond. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived. Tommy was doing homework when Sarah came into his room carrying an envelope with an official palace seal. Tommy's eyes went wide when he saw it, and his hands shook slightly as he carefully opened the envelope, trying not to tear the official seal. Inside was a letter from James, written in neat handwriting on palace stationery. The guard thanked Tommy for his letter and drawings, telling him that the artwork now hung in his locker at the palace barracks. He shared details about his daily duties, describing the ceremony of changing the guard and the history behind various uniform elements. He encouraged Tommy's interest in military history, suggesting several books that might interest him, but the part of the letter that meant the most was personal. James wrote that meeting Tommy had reminded him why service mattered, that seeing the world through Tommy's eyes had renewed his own sense of purpose and dedication. He wrote that he thought about Tommy often, wondering how he was doing, hoping that the boy continued to pursue his dreams with the same enthusiasm he had shown at the palace. Tommy read and reread the letter, hardly believing that James had taken the time to write such a thoughtful response. That night, he carefully placed the letter in a special folder he had designated for correspondence with his guard friend. He was already planning his reply, thinking about what stories and drawings he wanted to share next. The correspondence continued over the months that followed, with letters exchanged every few weeks. James always responded to Tommy's letters, each reply filled with interesting information about palace life, encouragement for Tommy's studies, and genuine interest in the boy's daily experiences. Tommy began to see James not just as the guard who had helped him stand, but as a mentor and friend who believed in his potential. The impact of that day at the palace extended beyond just Tommy. Sarah found herself more patient and optimistic, quicker to notice acts of kindness in the world around her. She started a blog documenting their experiences raising Tommy, and the story of James and the palace became one of her most shared posts, inspiring other families facing similar challenges. David became more involved in disability advocacy, using Tommy's story as an example of how small acts of inclusion and respect could have profound impacts. He spoke at parent groups and community meetings, challenging people to think about how they could make spaces more welcoming for everyone. At the palace, James's actions that day also created ripples. Captain Reynolds had written up the incident in his official reports, praising James's compassion and judgment. The story spread through the guard ranks, and several guards found themselves thinking more carefully about their interactions with the public, looking for opportunities to make positive connections. The palace administration took note as well. They began training guards on how to appropriately engage with visitors who had special needs or challenges, using James's interaction with Tommy as a case study in compassionate service. What had started as one guard's spontaneous act of kindness became part of the institutional culture, shaping how all guards approached their duty to serve. For Tommy's 9th birthday, 6 months after their palace visit, a package arrived from James. Inside was a children's book about the history of the Royal Guards, signed by several current guards, including James himself. There was also a new pin, this one featuring Tommy's name engraved on the back, making it uniquely his. James's birthday card expressed pride in Tommy's continued growth and encouraged him to keep pursuing his interests and dreams. The birthday gift sparked another idea. Tommy decided he wanted to raise money for a charity that helped other children with mobility challenges. With his parents' help, he organized a small art show at his school, displaying his drawings of the royal guards and the palace. He sold prints of his artwork, with all proceeds going to the charity. The event was a success, raising far more money than they had anticipated and giving Tommy a sense of purpose and accomplishment. When Tommy wrote to James about the fundraiser, the guard's reply was filled with admiration. James told Tommy that he had shown the kind of servant leadership that defined the best guards, thinking beyond himself to help others. He encouraged Tommy to continue using his talents and experiences to make a positive difference in the world. As time passed, the story of Tommy and James became something of a local legend in their small town. People who heard about it were moved by the simple beauty of human kindness, the way one person's compassion could change another person's life. Teachers used the story in their classrooms, parents shared it with their children, and community members pointed to it as an example of the world they wanted to create. For Tommy, the experience fundamentally shaped how he saw himself. Before that day at the palace, he had sometimes felt defined by his wheelchair, by what he couldn't do. But standing with James's help had shown him that limitations were often temporary or contextual, that with the right support and determination, seemingly impossible things could happen. He still used his wheelchair, still faced daily challenges related to his condition, but he approached those challenges with increased confidence, secure in the knowledge that he was capable and valuable exactly as he was. The guard pin on his backpack became a symbol not just of a special memory, but of his own strength and worth. A year after their first visit, the Martinez family returned to the palace. James had arranged for them to have a special behind-the-scenes tour, just as he had promised. Tommy got to meet multiple guards, see the barracks and training areas, and even try on a ceremonial hat that was far too large for his head, but made him laugh with delight. The highlight of the visit was another photo with James, this time with both of them standing. James lifted Tommy again, and they posed together, both saluting with broad smiles. This photo joined the first one in Tommy's room, showing the continuity of their friendship and the lasting impact of their initial meeting. During that visit, Tommy gave James something he had been working on for months, a detailed drawing of the palace and its guards, matted and framed professionally. It had taken him countless hours to complete, each detail carefully researched and rendered. James accepted the gift with visible emotion, promising to hang it in his family's home where he could see it every day.